Bonjour à tous, bienvenue à cette 52e édition de Visions du Réel et bienvenue à cette masterclass avec Emmanuel Carrère, notre invité d'honneur qu'on attendait avec une impatience non dissimulée. D'abord, un petit point pratique pour indiquer à tous ceux et toutes celles qui nous regardent à distance que sur YouTube, vous pouvez trouver une traduction simultanée de cette masterclass en anglais. Pour les gens qui sont dans la salle, it's the same. There is a way for you to listen to the masterclass in English. There is simultaneous translation, so ask for help if you cannot do that. On est très heureux de vous voir si nombreux, d'être dans une salle ensemble, que Emmanuel Carrère soit avec nous ici. Je ne vais pas faire un long discours parce qu'il va y avoir on va beaucoup parler aujourd'hui et je veux pas me rajouter à ça. Juste vous dire un petit mot quand même peut-être de cette invitation qui m'est très chère. C'est effectivement un très grand honneur et bonheur évidemment d'accueillir Emmanuel Carrère ici pour le festival, mais à titre personnel aussi. J'ai une très grande admiration pour son œuvre depuis de longues années. Je crois que c'est à l'origine Luciano Barizon, le directeur précédent de Visions du Réel, qui m'avait parlé de Limonov, qui a été le premier ouvrage et l'entrée en matière dans l'œuvre d'Emmanuel Carrère. Une entrée en matière évidemment puissante et marquante, un parcours hallucinant et halluciné. Ensuite, j'ai lu tous ses ouvrages et reste habité par ces lectures qui s'ancrent toujours dans un moment et un lieu donné, qui font partie intégrante des souvenirs de moments de vie, en particulier D'autres vies que la mienne, qui est le livre que je préfère dans toute son œuvre, qui m'aura fait pleurer des heures derrière des lunettes de soleil sur une plage, sur une île grecque ou peut-être en Italie. Alors bien sûr, Emmanuel Carrère a toujours entretenu un rapport étroit avec le cinéma, de journaliste, de scénariste, de réalisateur, de cinéphile. Mais au fond, ce n'est pas ce qui a motivé le plus cette invitation. Ce qui me semble particulièrement passionnant, c'est davantage encore la façon dont il aborde le réel, dont il s'en fait le témoin tout en étant partie prenante. Ce sont les récits à la première personne, les constats d'ignorance et la présence assumée, l'entrelac entre ses autres vies et la sienne. Et puis il y a aussi la quête du romanesque dans le réel que nous affectionnons tant à Visions du Réel. C'est là, à mes yeux, que se noue un lien étroit entre son œuvre et les cinémas présentés au festival, des films éminemment personnels, incarnés, assumés eux aussi, des films qui racontent le regard d'un ou d'une cinéaste sur quelque chose, loin, une fois encore, d'une pseudo-objectivité ou volonté d'informer. J'ai au cours des derniers jours été beaucoup questionné sur la question de la mise en scène dans le cinéma du réel, les frontières, les hybridations et tous les enjeux éthiques qu'elle véhicule. Nul doute que cette masterclass permettra à la fois d'envisager la position de l'auteur et sa liberté, mais aussi le romanesque du réel qui parfois outrepasse joyeusement la fiction. Je remercie très sincèrement Emmanuel Carrère de sa présence et de sa générosité et invite le président de Visions du Réel, M. Raymond Loretan, à me rejoindre pour lui remettre son prix d'honneur.
I would like to ask my colleague to come up to the rostrum to present the honorary prize.
Merci beaucoup. D'abord, j'aimerais vous dire le plaisir que j'ai de voir une salle à moitié pleine. Et je pense qu'on va réussir notre pari de festival hybride. Comme vous le savez, l'année passée, c'était totalement virtuel et là, il y a un net progrès.
Hybrid festival last year it was totally virtual, but we have progressed this year.
J'aimerais redire ici
Thank
que
you
c'est un
very much
signal
indeed,
aussi
the
très
audience, for
important
having
qu'on donne au
made the
reste
effort to be with us.
du
We are
monde de la
giving a very
culture.
important
C'est qu'il faut
signal to the rest of
profiter
the
de
world
toute la
of
marge
culture,
de manœuvre qu'on a
and we have
pour
to take advantage
revenir
of the
à des
room for maneuver that we
manifestations
have,
où les personnes se
the
rencontrent
leeway that we have to
physiquement,
come back to
où on a
physical
l'occasion
meetings at
d'échanger
which people have
en
a chance to
direct,
meet in
en
person and have an
présentiel,
opportunity
comme on
to
dit. Et
exchange.
je vous remercie d'être là dans ce
live.
sens-là et d'être aussi les témoins qu'on peut
Thank
sortir et on va sortir
for
de cette
being with us
crise
this
et
afternoon
que la
and for
culture
proving that
et
we
Visions du
can
Réel
and
veut
will
aussi dans ce
get
sens
out of this
jouer un
crisis,
rôle de
and
pionnier
that
comme nous
the
l'avons fait l'année
our
passée.
festival Visions du Réel will
Nous étions le
contribute
premier
to this
festival
as we did
à
last year.
passer
Last year,
du
our
présentiel au
festival was
virtuel
the
et cette année
first
on est le premier à passer
festival
du
to
virtuel
choose
au
to
quasi
move
présentiel.
from
Donc merci
physical
d'être
to
là.
virtual, and this year we are the first one to move
Petit
from
moment
virtual
officiel
back
pour
to
la remise du prix d'honneur à
hybrid.
Emmanuel Carrère. Laissez-moi dire quelques mots.
Let me say a few words first of all
D'abord,
about Emmanuel
cher Emmanuel
Carrère before we
Carrère,
present
que j'ai
this
eu
award to
l'occasion
him.
de rencontrer pour la
Emmanuel
première fois
Carrère, whom
hier
I
soir.
had the
Dans une contribution récente à la revue en ligne AOC intitulée Littérature et vérité, Gisèle Shapiro remarquait que si le roman réaliste du XIXe siècle revendiquait une fonction d'information et de connaissance entre le journalisme et la science, deux sources auxquelles il puisait pour étayer sa prétention à dire la vérité, le témoignage s'est imposé au XXe siècle comme modalité privilégiée d'accès des écrivains au réel et comme mode de légitimation du récit. Emmanuel Carrère, auteur, journaliste, scénariste, cinéaste, vous inscrivez cette geste des écrivains témoins des temps présents, du monde tel qu'il va, sous leurs yeux perplexes, qui ne croient pas ce qu'ils voient, tout en demeurant fidèles à leur perception subjective, partielle, mais véritable de ce que traversent les personnes et personnages dont ils vont à la rencontre. Au tournant des années 2000, tel est votre itinéraire escarpé, celui que vous avez choisi d'emprunter, abandonnant les vraisemblances auxquelles les auteurs de fiction sont le plus souvent tenus pour vous engager corps et âme dans des documentaires écrits à la première personne, à travers lesquels vous vous devez d'être toujours en mesure de répondre de ce que vous écrivez. Vous avez endossé cette responsabilité particulière de rendre compte d'existence réelle, d'autres vies que la vôtre, tout en vous situant par rapport à elle, en assumant votre place dans le récit, en ordonnant ce récit à partir de cette place, justement, pour camper cette position difficile, mais juste, qui consiste à ne pas escamoter le jeu, à s'assumer comme auteur-narrateur. Des gens écrivent pour raconter une version de la réalité qui leur convient davantage, et c'est une grande et belle raison qui pousse à écrire. Mais ce n'est pas du tout la mienne. Disiez-vous sur les ondes de France Culture en 2018. Ma visée en écrivant est une espèce de fidélité à l'expérience avec ce qu'elle comporte d'agréable et de douloureux et d'indéchiffrable. C'est cette fidélité qui constitue pour moi une forme de morale littéraire. Cette éthique, Emmanuel Carrère la partage notamment avec un des grands noms du cinéma direct, dont il a d'ailleurs choisi de montrer dans sa carte blanche un des plus beaux films, La Bête lumineuse. Interrogé sur sa pratique du montage, Pierre Perrault, puisqu'il s'agit de lui, répondait « Je prétends qu'il n'existe qu'un seul montage possible. À mes yeux, on peut manipuler du métrage comme on veut, évidemment, mais la seule direction possible pour moi, c'est une fidélité à ce qui s'est produit devant la caméra pendant le tournage et une fidélité au personnage. Cela ne me laisse guère de marge de manœuvre. Je peux éventuellement m'interroger sur comment dire, jamais sur quoi dire. Plus proche de nous, parce qu'il travaille aujourd'hui et maintenant, les cinéastes documentalistes que nous défendons et promouvons ici continuent eux aussi de tracer, chacune, film après film, des itinéraires possibles à travers la complexité du réel, dont ils tirent une expérience subjective
amid the complexity of the real, experimenting new forms of narration, but in the wake which has been created by some of their predecessors, Piero or Emmanuel Carrère, because thanks to the diversity and sincerity of your approach to reality, which you compose in powerful narratives, you are, at the end of the day, one of the great contemporary documentalists Donc, and it was only logical that we should pay tribute to you this year.
Convoquant le titre d'un de vos livres récents qui vous a été
So,
inspiré par le Yiking, le livre des transformations.
The Book of Transformations reminded us of the title of one of your latest books. And with that in mind, it's my honor and privilege to present to you the prix d'honneur of the 52nd edition of Visions du Réel. Emmanuel Carrère, thanks to your presence, we are able to know the direction in which we have to move forward.
Cher, je peux parler, oui. Non, alors, cher Raymond Lerédan, je vous remercie.
Thank you very much indeed, Raymond.
Le monsieur ou la dame qui vous remet un prix.
Usually the person who remits a prize to you says a few lines which are not particularly interesting, but today it was completely the opposite. Thank you for praising my work, but your words moved me a great deal. They were very moving for me. It is a great pleasure and privilege for me to attend this festival in this flattering setting. I won't speak any more than that. And thank you for inviting me to go walking in the Valais one day. Thank you, Emily, for your invitation. We're going to get started then. I'd like to call on Lionel Bayer, who is in charge of cinema at ICAL, and Emmanuel Chiffon, who is Emmanuel Chicon, who is a member of the selection committee of Visions du Réel and has been for many years, to moderate this masterclass.
Je crois que nous sommes sonorisés. Bon. Vous avez vu, en fait, le grand avantage de recevoir un cinéaste qui est aussi écrivain, c'est qu'on peut venir avec des objets amis. Et je me suis rendu compte qu'Emmanuel était venu avec une pile, que moi je suis venu avec une pile, c'est sans doute un espèce de truc de doudou.
Great advantage of this kind of occasion is that one can come along with personal items.
En même temps, je me dis qu'il y a quelque chose qui est très juste parce que les livres, c'est des vrais objets transitionnels entre vous et nous. Et comme vous les avez
So this is ensuring a kind of link between us.
À les relire, à les parcourir ces derniers temps, ils nous ont accompagnés et on les retrouve ici sur le plateau. Et on va peut-être commencer juste, si vous êtes d'accord. C'est drôle parce qu'on en a parlé tout à l'heure quand vous étiez en train de déjeuner. On a dit un mot sur.
When you were having lunch, someone told me something about a prize they received a year or two ago. This was when the meeting was a physical meeting. And he was being awarded the Grand Prix. And it was someone whom you like a lot, and you talked about his work, and you met him once at Cannes. And I would just like to read out a brief quotation. It's a kind of I can remember this episode. You were constantly talking about interviews which did not go off so well, or people that you interviewed, and that didn't make you feel very good. It's in Imanov. So you're talking about the moment you met Bernard Herzog in Cannes. So there's nothing compared with the interview with Herzog. I knew that he could not read French, so I did not expect him to tell me something about it. But I thought he would welcome with more warmth than he did a journalist who had spent a lot of time analyzing his works. He opened the door of his hotel room in the Carlton. He was not very well dressed. Of course, he was not smiling. I was smiling, but far too much. I was afraid that the press officer had not told him who I was, and that he did not distinguish me from the other journalists. And then I saw my book on his coffee table, and he made a few comments, and I hoped he would take over. And then he looked at me with some rather severe wisdom, and then in a very low voice, in a soft voice, but magnificent voice at the same time, he said, and I remember his exact words,
I know it's bullshit. Let's work. Let's work. Ça voulait dire, on fait l'interview, il faut bien, ça fait partie des emmerdements inévitables, comme les moustiques en Amazonie.
So he was saying that that's what he said, and I thought to myself that this was just a part and parcel of my work. I didn't know what to do. And but then I asked him one or two questions, and he replied very professionally. Unquote. So I hope we're not just going to talk about professional things. Mr. Carrère, the story was terrible, and I do admire Werner Herzog. At that time, maybe he was in a period of excessive megalomania. That was probably one of the greatest moments of media coverage that Herzog was enjoying at that time. He was really wrapped up in his own character. But what can justify that kind of treatment being meted out to a young journalist who had just written a book about him? It's detestable and incomprehensible. It's really enigmatic as well. What justifies proceeding in that manner, behaving in that manner? Question. Now, your relationship with Catherine Deneuve is rather complicated. You've told us, and at the same time we hear your inner voice and we read things in your place, things that you've written for us. But when I read that, I think, what is he thinking about the presentation of this prize? Emmanuel Carrère. Well, I think you related the story very well, and we're in the right place for that kind of narrative. Maybe I can take this opportunity to tell you the following. I was a great admirer of Werner Herzog's when I was a young man. I discovered his films at a fairly young age. I wrote a book about him when I was about 25. And then I detached myself from his films. And then I started to take fresh interest in his works about 15 or 20 years ago, because he came back to documentaries, because above all, Herzog is a great documentary film maker. It's not that I like his fiction films less, it's just that his fiction films are all the greater when they have documentary content. In other words, when his works are 100% fiction, then I have the impression that they're rather banal, rather trivial. But as soon as there is a documentary base in there, may well be taking the boy with which he did Kaspar Hauser. In itself, it's filming that guy is a documentary. And that is the strength of Herzog's cinema. And there we really get to the heart of what the documentary is. Question, maybe you're sharing something with him. You say something rather fundamental initially. You said you were impressed by his physical courage. In other words, it's someone who can walk right the whole width of Germany, if necessary. And you described his physique when you saw him in his hotel room. And one can find similar physical characteristics in you. Maybe the way in which you express yourself as a French intellectual is different from the way in which Werner Herzog expresses himself. So is it true that you admire this German way of expressing himself? Emmanuel Carrère. Yes, in a way, Herzog is a kind of hero. But there's something that I don't like about him? Well, it's a case that Herzog is capable of compassion for Aborigines who are in a very bad state, for people who are suffering from all the infirmities in the world. And yet, on the other hand, a young intellectual inspires contempt in him. It's as if he just wanted to crush the person like an ant. There's something heroic about him, and there's maybe something slightly fascist, but that does not prevent him from being a very great artist. In that book, Ivanov, I wrote about Herzog. The book is about about a fascist. And I think it would be a mistake to ignore, to fail to recognize the attraction of fascism. Question: when he saw me on his doorstep, he probably wanted to crush me. Mr. Carrère, yes, maybe the treatment that he had in mind for you, but it's really acrobatic. Question. But as regards Ivanov, you have some opposing ideas, and you also take an interest in this character, who really is a character whom you approach as a hero, who led an adventurous life which fascinated you. Yes, Mr. Carrère, what fascinates me in that book and what fascinates me about Herzog is that he's a guy who spent his whole life remaining true to the dream of a young boy. In other words, so that he wanted to live the life of a hero. And he is the hero that he is. And this implies a lot of courage. To have been and done what he has been and done. He has refused a lot of things, but he's always displayed a lot of courage, which was admirable when he was in prison, for example. And the question, do you think this physical courage is superior to intellectual courage? Do you think being involved physically is something superior to you? Answer.
Soyons très concrets, quoi. Le courage de mener une vie qui fait qu'on se retrouve à
passer
2 ans dans une prison à régime.
The courage that he had to spend 2 years in prison in Russia, which was pretty tough, and if you come out having grown as a result of the experience, is quite impressive. This does not preclude the admiration that I have for his intellectual courage. Question. In the field of literature, there's a character that marked the beginning of your entry to fiction, the author of science fiction, which you never really came back to, this discovery of a Dickian universe. This is the author Dick. Maybe you could say something about the world of this author Dick.
This very morning, I agreed to write a preface for a series of re-editions, republications of Dick's novels. There is a general trend to more or less ennoble Dick's status, Philip K. Dick's status. And this is a very prestigious edition, for example, republication. And so there will be 5 books that will be published within this reissue. So yes, I got involved in this, and it's true. These are books that I discovered as an adolescent and which never let me go, so to speak. But I think that above and beyond my personal and individualistic predilection for these books, I think that as time goes by, the importance of these works emerges. Dick's books are, he died in 1982, and I really have the impression that a lot of the fiction, especially popular fiction that's been developed, films, books, and so on, the most seminal works in terms of the perception of the world really come from Dick. They're influenced by Philip K. Dick. Matrix, for example, the Truman Show, Existence, The Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, and other similar films. These are not adaptations of Dick's novels, but there was a time when I was a bit shocked, and I'd say, oh, well, that's awful. Truman Show I saw not long ago. It's a great film, but people shouldn't say that this is an adaptation of a Philip K. Dick novel, Time Out or something like this. Well, I was a bit shocked when I heard this. I thought, and in reality, now, it saddens me a bit because Baudelaire used to say that genius is, it means, well, that Dick, what he describes is not his world, it's our world. The world in which we live is a Philip K. Dick novel. All of this fiction, to give the example of Matrix, which is also an adaptation of Philip K. Dick. In Matrix, we're experiencing this. This is an absolute reference for everyone. All of this is irrational discourse and so on. Well, it's based on this. And this is virtually the question that we're asking ourselves philosophically speaking, existentially speaking, all day long. So I think that it's very surprising that there is a guy who really got it in terms of what the world was going to become. This is fascinating. And there are good reasons why we keep on reading Dick more and more. And once again, by recognizing his importance, but we don't even need to recognize it anymore. Yes, it's good that you brought up Philip K. Dick. You could also speak of Stephen King when we're talking about works, because there's something interesting in the Visions du Réel Film Festival, because this, we're talking about the world of fantasy, because you have to describe this with great precision so that the viewer can see this gap. When Stephen King really describes the life of the average American in a small rural town, and it's a bit like a documentary. And Philip K. Dick, in terms of feelings, it's almost a documentary approach. And Mr. Carrère says, yes, I agree, you're absolutely right. So I said to myself back in 1993, I didn't know really how I could find out about Philip K. Dick's life. There are two very good American biographies, which I have. I've spent maybe 10 days coming up with a detailed timeline, and then he thought of this, and then he wrote that, and then I just dumped the two biographies, and based on this chronological and biographical timeline, I reread chronologically all of his works, starting from the principle that you could read them as an autobiography, which is interesting because these are books that really come from the imagination, someone's imagination. And I realized that it worked. It was a perfect approach. And I had a lot of fun. I would take a conversation from a book between a robot and an android or something like this, and I could put this, I could hear something, a quote from Philip K. Dick at the time was something he said in public, and it really worked very well. It was a perfect fit. Now, so I covered a science fiction writer. I looked into him in a very documentary approach. This is really the approach of a documentalist, a documentary filmmaker, because yes, there's a certain amount of concision in terms of his feelings. But one of your colleagues, Michel Goldbeck, who was here a few years back, and he said, why is science fiction work doesn't really have a place in the French literature? Yes, there's Jules Verne, okay, but there is a kind of this imperialistic feeling, and there's the new wave, and then there wasn't really much space left for science fiction and the description of daily life, but with a metamorphosis. I hadn't really thought about it, yes, but that's quite right. And we could, another thing we could say, another point we could make, Welbeck and I, we both started our literary careers. He wrote about Kraft, and I wrote about Dick, Philip K. Dick. And I think that this was a very formative experience for both of us, more than other French writers. So we really come from this fertile soil. Also, in the case of Welbeck, he's someone who has a scientific background, which I myself do not have. And you can really see this in what he writes. And several of his books are really science fiction. This is science fiction. So this is a novel, but it's also an investigation. But so you have a horror story or a fantastic or whatever, and then this generates something which then germinates into something horrible at the end of the book. You go a bit further because there's a trial, and when you read The Adversary and you look at this fantastic dimension and strange things that happen in everyday life, and this means that there are very strange things that happen and that really could affect the lives that we have. Yeah, I'm at a service station, and then there are these micro events that occur. Yes, well, for example, David Lynch, he's very, very good at this. I don't want to compare myself to David Lynch, but when you're talking about someone waiting on a parking lot in everyday France, but I thought of something, though. This made me think of a question. Okay, I'm at a documentary film festival, but I'm starting to think of documentaries and get to give some thought to my own work from a documentary approach. So you're kind of psychoanalyzing your oeuvre. Yes, exactly, says Mr. Carrère. So, and once again, it's that has a direct impact on what I do, on my work. But Emily said this a few minutes ago, there's this question of seeming reality, or likelihood, one could almost say. With a story like The Adversary, l'adversaire, and this is a very likely story. Well, if it weren't true, I would have said, well, the idea is very interesting, but it's not very plausible. So there's this whole dimension of plausibility. You know, and this guy didn't get picked up by the Social Security, the tax authorities, and so on. Well, those who attended the trial, they were expecting that this personage nobody spotted this in it before. And so this really led to the conclusion that fiction is really linked to plausibility. We tend to consider that fiction is the place for imagination. No, fiction must be likely, or else nobody believes in it. But reality is much freer, and there are some pretty incredible, implausible things that happen in reality. Now, when Roman breaks his wrist, and you deal with this like you inject a fantastic dimension. You said that this was going to generate something terrible, but you're not really in a novelistic description. You describe this as something that happens, and then the story continues, and this is one of the first elements which we see that there's a widening, ever-widening gap with reality. And here, there's something that's really linked to the construction of this fantastic dimension. We launch out into the unknown dimension. So, yes, there are these micro events, one after the other, and because of this, we find ourselves in this monstrous situation. At what point does this become impossible to really go back? Well, for a long time, he could have said, okay, well, he might have looked ridiculous, or he might have had to go to prison for some of these petty swindles or things like this. And if he had got caught, well, he wouldn't have killed everyone. And so I think that you share something with him and other figures in the novel, and you do this when you're doing an investigation, because you really put yourself in danger. Like Truman, you are an admirer of Truman Capote. When you talked about the criminal in Cold Blood, I got the impression that we grew up in the same house. And I went out through the front door and he went out through the back door. And that's a very fitting image. And I feel that you're comparing this and with him as well, there's a desire to really sink into these problems, the cinema, literature, the novel, and so on. And he goes out the back door rather than the front door. And indeed, yes, this was predicated on lies, this crime. And it was too hard for him. So he said that he had had a cancer, for example. But if he really had had a cancer, then he would have realized, he would have had a very different perspective on all of this. So this is a reality. Do you recognize this? Or no, I recognize it. Yes, of course. But something happened with this book, namely, all the time I was writing it, I was ashamed to write it. So I was kind of in a sort of depression, because I was thinking, what kind of terrible things do you have to have in your head to really tell this story? Why? People say that if somebody reads this and this is what their father was like. And when the book was published, yes, it was quite successful, more successful than anything I'd written hitherto. And we're not just happy when a book does quite well in the market, but because, in fact, what this meant was that this was of interest to everyone, because this impacts everyone, because people feel concerned by this, because this is why I didn't feel as alone, because I was a monster, because I was interested in this story, because I realized that other people were just as interested in it as I, and if they were interested in it, this was because this struck a universal chord in them. Because the fact that you forget all of your family, well, fortunately, that's not universal. And honestly, I don't see what circumstances could arise where I would forget my entire family or neglect them completely. But so what this is about, this gap between the brave image, this idea of plausible image, and we try to convince people that we're worthwhile, and then we we all do this, and this book tells this story, but it tells it in a very exacerbated, tragic fashion. But this comes down to an experience that is common to all of us. So if I say that, yes, I recognized myself in the novel, but it was a scary experience in the beginning, but then afterwards, I said, yes, this is our common fate. And at a point in time. So you did a film about a serial killer. So if you do have a link, yes, please send it to me. But honestly, when I was contacted and I was asked to attend the trial of another very terrible serial killer, well, I can't project myself into this because, yes, I could really come up with a bunch of things in my conscience, but this guy raped and killed a great many people. So no, I'm sorry. No, I just can't feel an interest in this. There's no desire, even hidden desire, for me to really look into this and dig deeper. So what I was missing was this idea of projecting myself. I can't get interested enough in this film. So I looked at the victim because, as you, there's a kind of otherness that seems very distant and is very hard to relate to. No, the killer's final victim, the last victim recognized him, and it's thanks to this victim that we were able to recognize him because he tied up the final victim. Why? There were many different entry points with the novel. You could have done a portrait of his spouse or his mistress or whatever. Why, despite everything, did you? Because a novel gives you the time. No, I did the opposite. I did it with something that was more complicated. That's how you see it. Well, at first sight, in terms of dramatic, yes, well, obviously the main killer, the protagonist, is Roman, the killer. And then to find an entry point, well, obviously yours is a little more stealthy, I could say. If we look at this from the victim's perspective, and then the aggressor attacks them, and people can die, for example, and the horror of the situation is that the figure actually survives, the character survives. And we're talking about the tracks of the hunter hunting someone in one of your other books. So I don't know if it's easy, but this was a place you went and tried to really understand. And you do this very well in the book. And I think this is why the book was so successful. It's not because we have a taste for the morbid, it's because it's the opposite. Your book really talks about the very daily nature, how this man organized his daily life and then committed this terrible things. Yes, this is true, says Mr. Carrère, but another reason why the book took so long to write itself and had to go through so much writer's anguish and so on, because it took me such a long time to find the proper entry point, as you mentioned. And this is due to the fact that I tried to write this from an objective fashion, like Truman Capote with his novel In Cold Blood. So the book is a masterpiece, but immoral. And you speak of this quite well in a text that you wrote about Truman Capote, and you published this. And you talked about this black box which documents things as an author, a writer, and so on. And this gives me an entry point with a view in relation to our viewers, to the audience. When we talk about this dialogue, this doppelganger, and the idea here is to find the proper distance, as with a documentary, but there's also your confrontation, so to speak. So it's the horn of the bull, it's a bit further than with Truman Capote. this documentary narrative in which you launched out with when you wrote the adversary. But I really hope that you could perhaps read out an excerpt from this text about Truman Capote that was written quite a while ago. So as we get ready for this, because I'm sorry that the discussion is kind of going all over the place, but I had really prepared this very carefully. But we have to, you can ask questions. Well, and the thing is, you can't prepare everything, and that's kind of the principle of the documentary.
Non, on t'entend pas.
Ça arrive maintenant? OK. Capote, en 1960,
in 1960, Truman Capote was a very well-known writer who looked for a means to make sure that there was no second act in the life of an American writer. He developed a theory on what he called the nonfiction novel that we could call the documentary book, and look for a subject that would enable him to flesh out this theory, something which normally would come down to reportage. So he would create a work along these lines. And once in the New York Times, he came across an article that told the story of the murder of a family in Kansas. And he said to himself, aha, a crime. Well, why not? So he set out for Kansas. He set up in the small town where this murder took place. He met with the sheriff who carried out the investigation. He started to talk to the people from the small town. And Truman Capote, with his very strange voice, and this had a strange impression on the rednecks from this Kansas town. And everyone know, now he really kind of fitted into this little town. And if you, for instance, you go into the Pays de Gex near Geneva, where everything happened here, you were embedded, so to speak. You had a drink with the people there. And then this would really help me understand the trauma of these families and understand what we call the near sources for this preliminary investigation. But this was different from the atrocious crime that Truman Capote wrote about. On the one hand, there was the question of the exterior. In this, there were people who, during the night, broke into someone's home, into this farm, and really massacred the whole family for $50. Now, this gangrene that comes from these circumstances, for me, the important thing was to have access, to be able to access this work, so I wrote it. So I'm going to really go for it, because I'm the only survivor. So I would hope that it's possible to understand and write a book that would relate this trial. I'm not really driven by an unhealthy curiosity. What you did is not really the work of a madman. It's the work of a man really pushed to the end, and I would just like to show him at work. So,
ouais, 3 ans. Qui était une demande de rencontre, en fait.
Qui était une
3
demande de
years.
rencontre.
It was a request for a meeting. Yes, says Mr. Carrère.
Le moins qu'on puisse dire, c'est que je le.
The least you can say is that
du poil. Je pense que je n'en ai pas conscient à ce point. Vous entendant le lire, je me dis putain, c'est bon.
Complied with his wish.
Parce que j'en suis venu par moments à parler de ce qu'il avait fait comme quelque chose qui lui était arrivé, quoi. Pas que c'est.
He was talking about something which had happened to him. Something scandalous.
En fait, ce qui s'est passé, c'est qu'ensuite, tout ce que j'essayais d'investir dans ce livre, c'est investi dans un livre qui s'appelle La classe de neige, qui est un très court roman, et qui est le livre de fiction que j'ai écrit,
short novel called La classe de neige. And shortly after the publication of the book, the roman, the criminal 3 years later replied to me saying that he had just read this book and that he was very moved by it and that he thought it was a very accurate narrative of his own childhood. And at that point in time, he was willing to see me. And I must say that at that point in time, I felt quite a bit of anguish because I had moved on to something else. I did not want to go back to this matter. I had made the first move to reach out to him. So it was difficult for me to say that this matter no longer interested me. So I got in touch with him again. And Capote said that when he started to deal with this matter, he did not realize that he was going to get a 5-year sentence and that this was going to leave him absolutely exhausted. It took me 7 years. One surprising thing is that the story of In Cold Blood is very weak. It's just an odd incident. It's two thugs who kill a family. What's interesting is the relationship between them. I think that Capote must have chosen this out of pride, must have said, you're going to see what you're going to see. And wrote the book. Question, this was a kind of unbearable moral trap for you, was it not? And you did this with nothing. Yes. In fact, this was Flaubert's dream, to write a book which was based on nothing. That was Flaubert's dream. Capote was fascinated by Flaubert, and Flaubert is also an author who is extremely impersonal, an author who is everywhere and nowhere, like God in his book. So Capote wanted to be completely absent from his book. He wanted his book to be totally impersonal. But what is extremely ambitious is that Capote became a player in his story. So the story of the two guys who killed the farmer, well, you can tell the story just like that. But Capote started to relate what happened as from the point in time at which the two guys were arrested until their execution. But the last part of the book concerns the 3 or 4 years that the guys spent on death row, and he was the most important person in their lives at that time. He went to see them every 2 or 3 days. He was their correspondent. He was their link with the outside world. And he told them that they were going to do appeal after appeal, lodge appeal after appeal, and he was going to find them the best attorneys. Whereas in reality, Capote knew one thing. He knew that in order to complete his book the way he wanted to, the two guys had to be hanged. He told them, oh, you're going to receive grace, presidential grace. But in fact, at the same time, he was going to light candles in a church and praying that they be hanged. There are some things that he did not relate in the book. The book is an immense book, and one which I often reread, which you've referred to many times over the years. Yes, there's Mr. Carrère. It's not just, an author does not just write about a minor criminal incident without it its implications hanging very heavily over him. Question, but it was also a case of imposture. Mr. Carrère, there was some question of this when the book was published in the last 10 or 15 years. There have been 2 films that have related this. There was a very good adaptation by Richard Brooks of In Cold Blood quite a long time ago, but there were 2 films which were the making of In Cold Blood. One with Hoffman playing Capote in a very excellent way. I tried to write the book L'Adversaire for a long time, objectively, like In Cold Blood, yes, but there was something which didn't work. Because once when the book was published, I appeared on the TV program in France called Apostrophe, which was really the program at the time for literary works, and there was one author who was present there, and he rather violently attacked my book, said the book was bad and so on. He said that I had lacked courage. He said that I should have written in the first person. Well, if you tell me the book is bad, well, that's your opinion. But I think it's morally unacceptable to tell me I should have written it in the first person. The whole idea was that the criminal was unable to say, I have done this. So if I'd written it in his place, I would have deprived him of the possibility of one day telling the story in his own name, in the first person. And it was not possible to tell the story in the third person, neutrally. So at one point in time, I realized that the only way to do it was to narrate the story in the first person being me. Question? So this is something which is going to be your style, which is going to mark your works. One could say that this was accidental. You almost decided not to write the story because of the difficulties, and then one day you said that you would get down to writing the book to leave a trace. Mr. Carrère? Well, at one point I was relieved to abandon the plan. I've been working on this for years, and I was going to write down a kind of brief record of what I'd done. And then I wrote what was to become the first sentence of the book. And well, I was not completely stupid. I realized that I was beginning to write the book itself. And this was the point in time at which I realized that I had captured the right tone. Do you have a copy of the book there? It's the point at which I found the way in which I wanted to write. On Saturday, 9th of January 1993, while Jean-Claude Roman was killing his wife and children, I was attending a school meeting with one of my children. We then went to have lunch with his parents, and then I won't read out the rest. All of a sudden, I had the idea for the book. All of a sudden, I had all the elements that I needed. But there was a way in which I brought together his story and brought it closer to mine, which may now appear to be very simple, but at that time was it's difficult for me, but I found something which was specific to me. Question.
la littérature produit du direct. Vous dites quand vous
when
avez
you
rencontré, quand
you've
vous
said
avez
that literature
cette
produces
femme qui était la première amoureuse de elle qui est restée,
narratives.
qui a été retrouvée à côté de Nick, le soldat hongrois. Vous dites si
When
j'étais au
you
cinéma, il faudrait
wrote
que je
about the
me
woman
refasse
who
le
was
moment,
found
ça,
next to
même si
the
c'est du documentaire,
Hungarian
il faudrait
soldier
qu'on
Nick,
revienne le moment. Le cinéma n'est jamais du direct, alors que la littérature c'est du
you
direct.
said that cinema is never direct. It's never live.
C'est du direct, c'est le direct pur. Mais vous avez raison.
Mr. Carrère, you're right. People think that cinema is live, but of course it's not. Question. So what accompanied you was this notion of what is direct, what is live.
C'est arrivé maintenant, on est à côté de la frontière, c'est arrivé à quelques kilomètres de nous. Et en relisant le livre, je me
And
disais,
this story happened only a few kilometers away from Geneva, from the Geneva border.
Votre verbe, votre façon de l'écrire donne un sentiment tout le temps
But the way in which you write it gives us a feeling of
de
immediacy.
Balzac ou Flaubert, des écrivains du 19e qui sont déjà dans le romantisme du souvenir, ou en tout cas de...
And this is very different to the romanticism novels of an author like Flaubert.
D'intention pour Kotelnik, vous dites, quand on montrera le film, mais que ce qui se sera passé, c'est plus ce qui se passe, mais ça se sera passé, je pourrais raconter l'histoire au cinéma parce qu'on sera dans le passé.
Now, you know that this is a story that you will be able to narrate in the cinema because once it's shown in the cinema, it's something which is in the past and no longer in the present. It's no longer live or direct.
On peut regarder un extrait d'ailleurs parce qu'on parle depuis un petit bout de temps.
Maybe we could see an excerpt.
Vous parlez du montage en disant
So we've been talking for a while.
Ce qui nous est arrivé. Voilà. Et donc du coup, ça deviendra du cinéma et ça s'appelle le montage, ouais.
What is happening is will become what will have happened to us.
Est-ce qu'on pourrait lancer du coup
Could we maybe show extract number 3, excerpt number 3?
Ça veut dire que ce sera quoi? On nous dit pas. On regarde puis on découvre.
I think that would be apposite to illustrate what we're talking about right now.
On peut peut-être rester là.
Ce récital improvisé, juste avant de reprendre le train pour Moscou, ça a été en fait le déclencheur de toute l'histoire. Il y avait cette voix, cet élan vers nous, les histoires un peu confuses qu'elle nous racontait. Il y avait la langue française, le fait qu'elle soit étrangère à la ville. Il y avait l'ombre du FSB, l'école d'interprète militaire où elle disait avoir fait ses études et où, d'après notre Sacha, on formait des espions. Tout cela faisait un mélange que je trouvais romanesque, et quand je l'ai revu 1 an et demi après, je dois avouer que je me suis senti floué.
Moi, pas beaucoup du russe, tu vois, ni много, donc. Bon. Alors, tu as un bébé maintenant. Il a quel âge?
Le 21, il aura 5 mois.
5 mois. Et alors, mais tu habites surtout, tu habites à Kirov ou tu habites à côté de Nyon?
Avec mon enfant, parce que l'appartement à louer, les avions avec Alexandre ici, c'est pas très confortable pour mon bébé.
Oui.
De plus qu'il n'y a pas d'eau chaude, etc.
Oui.
Et on attend notre appartement.
Ah, vous attendez un appartement à côté de Nyon, c'est ça? Ah, d'accord.
J'attendais la Matahari de Kotelnitch. Je me retrouvais devant une jeune mère de famille qui me paraissait banale et à qui je ne savais plus très bien quoi dire.
Hein?
Je suis un peu émue. Pourquoi on fait ça? On me filme, moi je suis très émue.
Ah bah parce qu'on filme tout ce qu'on fait ici, de toute manière. On filme tout. On filme absolument tout quand on rentre, quel que soit.
Toi, mais Emmanuel, moi, tout le monde.
Mais de toute manière, je vais tout te raconter ce qu'on fait exactement. Parce qu'en plus, je vais te demander, on t'en aide, enfin, bien sûr, c'est Sacha qui est notre traducteur principal, mais si tu peux, toi aussi, nous donner un petit coup de main aussi comme traductrice, etc. Ça serait.
C'est très bien pour moi et très bien pour moi. Mais
écoute, je pense.
En plus, je m'empêtrais dans un stratagème absurde. Comme j'avais peur que son Sacha se méfie si elle apparaissait comme personnage de notre film, j'avais proposé qu'elle travaille pour nous comme interprète d'appoint. C'était cousu de fil blanc, je n'avais évidemment pas besoin de 2 interprètes, mais Sacha avait accepté, négocié le tarif, $50 par jour, et je me retrouvais prisonnier de ma ruse.
On est déjà venu voir Alexandre.
Ici, avec la caméra.
Hein? Ah non, pas avec la caméra, on avait laissé la caméra dehors. Et puis on connaît aussi le journaliste du journal du côté Vietnam. Tu veux que je t'accompagne? Tu veux que je vienne prendre? Non?
Oui, pourquoi pas.
D'accord, écoute, je viens.
Ah non.
Non?
Emmanuel, non.
D'accord, je t'accompagne pas. Alors attends, une seconde. On va. Voilà, attention. Oui, tu peux.
Là, j'ai repris espoir. Un peu de parano FSB, un peu de secret, ça nous éloignait des couches et des manuels de puériculture. Cette fois-ci, c'est nous qui l'avons accompagnée à la gare pour prendre le train de Kirov, la grande ville la plus proche où elle habitait chez sa mère, en attendant le nouvel appartement. Elle prenait très à cœur son nouveau travail. Elle racontait qu'elle avait commencé à traduire l'éducation sentimentale pour son plaisir et aussi parce que c'était un bon entraînement. Elle nous proposait des idées. Par exemple, filmer les trafics au passage du train de Pékin.
Oui,
donc à l'arrêt, ils achètent des vêtements
oui, du train.
Et hop, et ils les revendent au marché.
Vous pourrez le filmer. Pourquoi pas? Non?
Ah oui, ça serait bien, oui.
Et pourquoi pas? Moi, je savais
Ça serait
que...
bien. Mais là, il faudrait savoir à quel... Mais non, tu sais, il y a beaucoup de choses qu'on ne sait pas.
C'est une entité très importante pour les gens de côté de Nyon.
Mais ça fait seulement 1 semaine qu'on est là, tu comprends?
Вы не знаете, когда поезд корейский какой-то, китайский, там какой корейский? Девчонки, вы не знаете, когда бывает поезд китайский или корейский? Не знаете? Ну, надо постарше кого-нибудь. Bon, les gens qui sont plus âgés, bien sûr, s'occupent de ça. Mais ici, il y a toujours...
Trouver les sujets, aller à la pêche au renseignement, c'était en principe le travail de notre Sacha qu'elle s'est mise à faire tout naturellement.
On prend le vêtement ici pour le revendre au marché, pour avoir de l'argent.
Ça serait bien qu'on puisse voir ça. Et tu le téléphones dès que tu reviens.
à côté de Nietzsche.
Oui, dès que tu reviens à côté de Nietzsche. Hein. Et à ce moment-là, tu fais la traduction pour nous. D'accord.
Et je me préparerai.
Voilà, tu travailles bien ton français, hein, tu fais encore un chapitre de l'éducation sentimentale. Hein, en même temps que tu...
Ah oui, d'accord.
Voilà, un deuxième chapitre.
C'est une bonne idée.
Tu t'entraînes et on compte sur toi pour traduire avec pour nous.
Premier extrait donc de votre entrée en cinéma finalement. Vous entrez en cinéma avec ce geste documentaire qui est Retour à côté de Nietzsche, qui reste 18 ans après, c'est frappant, un objet absolument non identifié dans la galaxie du cinéma contemporain ici.
And even 18 years later, it has still not been really identified. It's a mixture of improvisation in relation to reality and retrospective about what had happened to you and what you were expecting.
La façon dont vous réécrivez les images, vous ne réécrivez pas l'histoire, vous faites avec, mais vous portez dessus un regard qui est bien sûr
your images are not a rewrite of history, you're living with history.
Pendant longtemps, qui se fait plusieurs fois, en plusieurs
project which you bore within you for a long time.
Dont le troisième en fait va finalement ordonner ces fragments épars que vous aviez rassemblés.
Give order to these fragments which you had assembled during this stay, which was in June.
Exactement comme vous écrivez vos récits documentaires, vous prenez position.
And exactly as you write your documentary narratives, you take a position in the narrative.
Et de son fils, qui ont été sauvagement assassinés.
And through the protagonists whom we've just seen.
Déjà sur le banc de montage avec Camille Cotte.
And in fact, you were already doing the editing. In the end, you gave order to all these fragments, which you had accumulated in the course of several different shoots. Mr. Carrère. Of course, it's a pleasure for me to hear what you've just said. I like this film very much indeed. I'm very attached to it. And I like to keep seeing it again. The reasons have nothing to do with my merit. The reasons are quite trivial, because it's that the people I filmed moved me a great deal, and I'm pleased to see them again. Just in the same way that you see, you like seeing old friends again, distant friends, and you don't know what they've become in the meantime. And I think some of them are very moving, like the mother of Anya. She's a real character. Well, I don't want to tell you the whole story, but
j'ai fait un reportage de télévision pour le magazine français Envoyé spécial, qui est un magazine de reportage, dans une petite ville en Russie, sur une histoire assez bizarre qui est celle d'un soldat hongrois disparu à la fin de la Seconde Guerre mondiale et qui a refait surface en 2000, après 55 ans où il était resté à l'hôpital psychiatrique. J'avais fait ce petit reportage là-dessus, c'était la première fois que je me
trouvais à faire ça, on this subject. It was the first time I had to do such an assignment. I had done a lot of journalism before that, but this was the first time that I had to do filmed journalism. We were a team of 4. Film crew of 4 people. It's nice to go back to Kotelnitch, a small provincial Russian town. One had the impression that it had hardly moved since Chekhov's descriptions of Russia. It was a very depressing province, poor and slow moving. It's not very exciting to live there. That's what you can tell from the images, says the moderator. And we found this girl we see in the images, and I thought to myself, I want to find out more about them. I feel like filming. I had enjoyed this experience working for Envoyé Spécial, and I decided that I wanted to go and film things with a film crew. The project was a bit fragile. I thought I would just go to a small Russian town and we will film what happens there, assuming that something does happen there. If not, we will just film what we find there. So we started by filming what did not happen. I know documentary filmmakers like this film, which because it shows what documentary filmmakers have nightmares about, namely when nothing happens. So we went there, we stayed about 6 weeks there. And because now one films in video, one films much more. In the old days, film was much more expensive, and so we tended to be economical. But here we filmed an awful lot. We came back with about 150 cassettes. And I remember that while we were shooting, and I'm just saying this to pay tribute to the person, I called my producer, Dominique Toussaint. I was really rather worried about this, and I said to her, we're heading directly for the wall, nothing's going to happen. She said, well, if you're flipping out, that's normal, but I'm not flipping out. I think that's normal. Even if we only keep 5 minutes of this shoot, it'll be okay. So there was only one shoot. There were not supposed to be any further ones. What happened, in truth, but for a horrible reason, was that this young woman whom you've just seen, and who was singing in such a moving way, and whom I recruited with all the palaver that you saw in the excerpt, this young woman was murdered with her child who was only a few months old by a madman who cut them up with a hatchet. It was absolutely horrible. And then I went back in winter to the funeral. It was the 40th day of the mourning process, which is a very important date for the Russians. And in reality, we stayed there 4 days with the family. And it was completely the opposite of the shoot that we'd done in the month of June, which was relaxed, and we were able to languish, loll around the sun. But this time there was a lot of painful tension and a lot of emotional and verbal violence. And we drank a lot, the characters and I myself. This was something that I discovered while we were shooting. During the shoot, I was drunk. Everything moved very quickly. I didn't understand half of what they were saying in Russian. And when I asked the interpreter to tell me what they just said in Russian, the interpreter said, "Oh, it's none of your business." So this is what the film became. We were not able to know this in advance, and sometimes one cannot help feeling guilty. Of course, I had nothing to do with the murder of this young woman. But I had spent the previous shoot saying to myself, I hope that sooner or later something's going to happen to give a raison d'etre to our filming. And in the end, something did happen, this horrible event. Of course, I have no guilt, no responsibility here, but in a way, I felt a kind of relief, a sense of relief. So,
c'est bien pour le film.
C'est
so
horrible à
it's a
dire,
bit
mais
like
c'est vrai.
Capote said
Une
once.
question sur l'empathie, justement, d'un
So
étudiant de l'ECAL.
and
On va lui donner la
it's a
parole.
good idea
Tout en
you
haut,
went
si vous pouvez arriver
to
avec le
Russia.
micro, c'est Dario. Vous l'avez déjà le micro, non? Il arrive vers vous. Voilà, sur
There,
l'empathie
someone
apportée à cette personne.
someone has a question or comment.
Ouais, donc est-ce que vous m'entendez? Ouais, nickel. Du coup, j'avais une question concernant deux questions.
Two questions, in fact.
La première, c'est cet assassinat, est-ce qu'il a
This
modifié
murder,
ou est-ce qu'il a
did this murder
comment est-ce qu'il a
modify
amené le montage du film, parce que vous avez dit que c'est là où il y avait le film qui se créait.
the editing
Mais
of the
est-ce
film?
que
How
vous
did
avez
it
éprouvé, enfin,
change
est-ce
the
qu'il y a des
editing of the
scènes
film?
où vous avez éprouvé des émotions?
Were there some scenes in which you
Vous avez
felt
refusé peut-être une
emotion?
scène, vous en avez enlevé une parce
Did
que
you
vous
eliminate
étiez attaché à
some
cette femme que vous
scenes
pensiez
or
pas qu'elle allait
scene
mourir. Voilà.
because
Est-ce
you were
qu'il y a eu,
attached to this
ces
woman and you
changements-là?
did not
Et
think she was going to
la
die?
deuxième question, c'est aussi,
Were there changes of this type?
j'ai vu
That's
récemment
second
quand j'ai
question.
regardé le film que on ne voit pas beaucoup
When you
empathie
see
de ce qui se passe par rapport au reste des personnages.
film.
Alors, vous disiez que vous étiez ivre. Enfin, moi, je trouve que c'est pas du tout un mal en soi. Enfin, pas du tout, mais c'est juste savoir comment est-ce que vous le ressentiez. Est-ce que c'était en off? Est-ce qu'il n'y en a pas eu du tout? Enfin, comment est-ce que ça vous a pris
What is your feeling about the other
par le film que par
characters?
la réelle situation? Enfin voilà, comment est-ce que ça s'est un peu passé là-bas?
Alors,
Answer.
non, enfin, d'abord sur le, comme vous le disiez, je n'ai, en fait,
As you were saying,
j'ai appris la mort d'Ania alors qu'on venait tout juste de commencer le montage et qu'on était même juste au début de la phase de dérochage. C'est-à-dire que voilà, on se trouvait devant ces kilomètres de
before we started the editing process, we were faced with kilometers and kilometers of film.
La monteuse Camille Cotte avec un esprit positif.
I was really badly affected by the news.
Disons, mais c'est merveilleux. Et c'est à ce moment-là qu'on a appris sa mort. Et donc, j'ai été, on a été sidérés.
Knew that we were going to have an awful lot of work to do with editing. We were absolutely thunderstruck when we found out the news about Anna. I really did feel affection for her. We were only a small team, but we felt a lot of affection for her. She became a friend of ours. She was a bit of a storyteller, but everything in her was touching, was moving, and everything in that town was different. She spoke French that was already unusual, so she was a kind of black sheep in that town, and that's the main reason why I felt affection for her. So I thought that by going through her, we would see the town in a different light.
J'aurais appris sa mort dans un accident de voiture, ça m'aurait rendu très triste.
If I had learned that she had died in a car accident, I would have been very sad, but in circumstances like these, it was really horrible, atrocious. And the editor, who did not know the character who had been murdered, began to become affected by the news. I don't think that there are any scenes which I took out because they were not flattering for her, because they showed her in a bad light. I don't think there were any such scenes. But as regards the question of empathy,
moi j'ai l'impression d'avoir eu et d'ailleurs de garder une véritable affection.
I have the impression of really retained a lot of affection for the main characters in this film. What's true is that everything that we lived and experienced during these few days of mourning were very confused. As I've tried to explain, everything was very chaotic. I didn't really understand what was happening. And we had the impression that everyone was really seething with sadness and rage. After the funeral, there's a family gathering. The scene lasts 5 or 6 minutes, which is relatively long. The meal itself probably lasted 5 hours, and it was filmed in full. And so we filmed the whole of this meal. Now, this is not an artistic value judgment, but it was 5 hours of during which an awful lot of emotional violence was seen. And I thought that with this material we could make a film lasting 1 hour. And someone said to me, why don't you do that? I thought, well, it's not an absolute priority. When I see the scene, I don't think exactly the same thing as Dario, but there are two things which happen. There is the fact that you are invited into the family. And there's the relationship between the mother and the operator. But you are a kind of imported character. You're not part of the family, but you do have some family links with Russia. So you have the impression of being caught between two stools, as it were. Answer, yes, I always had the impression that I was looking left and right and caught between different people. Moderator.
Mais c'est pas faux. Cette espèce de truc, en fait, où on pleure, et puis on va se jeter dans le puis on va se battre, puis on va se disputer. Puis vous, malgré tout, comme Français, vous restez très extérieur à ça de par votre histoire.
The Russians tended to be very violent, and they were always quarreling. And you, as a Frenchman, you felt external to this, I'm sure. So the question is, how do the emotions fit into your work?
First of all, with regard to the Russian soul, yes, this expression, it's a bit of a cliche. Now, the important thing is to see to what extent the Russians really bear out all of these cliches about Russia. All of these cliches are true. They're sentimental and so on and so forth, this incredible intensity of feeling. And you can really see this in the film. But what's funny is that when we finished filming, when we finished the editing, we were in kind of an editing room, an improvised editing room, and it was the concierge office. And then we gave this back, and all of the rushes disappeared. We don't know exactly what happened. It's like somebody did the housework and cleaned up and everything disappeared. So the editor and I said, well, it's a bit of sad, but we'll move on to something else. And then the producer was cleaning house in her production facility. She said, oh, we found 2 cartons full, all of the rushes from the film. And so I rang Camille, but so we have our hands on them again. We got our hands on them. And I don't, maybe she has some room in her cellar to hold on to them, but this is where you had this idea that, for example, we could make a film, a separate film about the meal, this long family meal. Well, obviously this isn't a priority, but who knows? But I'm happy to know that it would be possible. No, when you write, you really adjectivize the characters. But you don't say a whole lot about yourself. You write a lot with a lot of precision about these people, but there's very little on the narrator himself. So in these films, I said to myself, that's funny.
Et pourtant, vous êtes très dans le corps. On vous voit danser à la fin.
You're there. We can even see you dance at the end.
Sur le quai du train avec les personnages.
And we saw you on the platform at the train station. You describe Anna and so on. It's more than what you say now. So when you film it, I can really feel that those feelings coming through. Yes, exactly. When you film it. But you're not filming yourself. Someone's filming you. And I would love to see the rushes for this film, to see that when you didn't get on the train. So to broaden the debate, to expand it a bit, we had gone to Kononich for the first round of filming, but someone said to me at the time, well, are you going to appear on screen or not? Oh, I don't really know, I answered. So this is a relatively important issue. It's an important question if you're talking about filming a documentary. And I said, oh, I don't know. So this really went back and forth. We started off with a real documentary, where you kind of pretend that you're not there, and little by little there was an interaction, and I started to actually speak and interact with some of the characters, and I started to actually enter into the field of what was being filmed, and so we become characters within the film. So then we enter in the field of filming, but this happened very gradually, and without really following any kind of determined direction. But when we really listen to you in the documentary, but you actually understand more Russian than what you say. You say that you don't speak it very well. Well, this, when you've had a bit to drink, it really helps you understand better. But notwithstanding, we see you and we ask ourselves, what is he thinking, and what is he thinking about the people that he's filming? So, well, I wasn't imagining anything about the film. But when you're editing, okay, and you heard about Anna's death, what direction was the film headed before then? Well, let me tell you. What the film would have become if Anna hadn't been killed so tragically. Well, there's a documentary, a film that I really like was a film by Frédéric Mitterrand at the time, where he shows pictures of Somalia, which is one of the poorest countries in the world, and you can see hunger and people starving. And then there's a text that is read by Frédéric Mitterrand. It's a text that kind of tells a story about suffering through love, and he's really working on the gap between this French bourgeois who's from a privileged upbringing and then what he's seeing on the screen. Now, what I'd like to say here is that perhaps we were going kind of in this direction, kind of a mix, and then I was telling things, telling personal things concerning my Russian family, my grandfather who was from Georgia and who immigrated to France, my grandmother, and who grandfather who was probably killed during the liberation because of some collaboration during the war, whatever. But it could have become this kind of film, and it became something entirely different. So we'll perhaps open this up for some more questions from the audience. questions that could come from the audience? I think that there are people who are actually here face to face. Yes, please, this gentleman here. Yes, please. Yes, can I ask a question? I would like to ask a question regarding empathy in the film. When you look at the photos, and I think that these came from the second filming, and I get the impression that that you added something here with this third round of filming. And what I was wondering, how this scene with the pictures, why it stayed in the editing, because why it wasn't used in the film, because I think this was a very powerful image. Well, yes. Yes, it was terrible indeed. But these are things that perhaps be edited out because of a feeling of discretion. But I didn't feel ashamed to keep it because I got the impression that this really revealed an emotion, a feeling that was very strong, very direct. And this woman, Anya's mother, obviously, she's disorderly, she's alcoholical, she can move from one subject to another. So I wasn't going to smooth everything out and make her perfect. No. So what made her very attaching and really a character that you'd see in a film because of this, because of who she was. So there was one thing, and Lionel also mentioned this, the fact that Philippe Lanier, the master operator, because he lived in Russia, when he heard that Anya died, he arrived immediately. So for her, it was something else. He wasn't just the operator. He was there. He was there for the funeral. So she had a certain amount of affection for him that I think that you can feel all the time, especially when she says, Philip, don't film, don't shoot this, don't film this. When she says, Philip, don't film this. And he moves the camera towards Sasha, the interpreters, and say, why are you filming the interpreter? So there's, it's the same thing. Sometimes they told me, she said, well, please don't film this. And why did you keep filming? I think that if she had really didn't want it for us to film her, then we would have stopped. And everything that, whenever Philip said, Philip, don't film this, I could have cut it out. I could have edited it out. Yes, I could have. But there are a lot of things. There are a lot of things that are very poignant and almost indecent, quote unquote, things that shouldn't be shown, that I don't regret at all having put in the film. Yeah, well, of course, I showed the film to these characters. When I showed her the film, Anna's mother, you know how she is. So from time to time, either she yelled at me, or she kissed me, or she hugged me, or whatever. It really varied a lot. So I showed this to Sasha, who was the ex Anya's ex. That was a really extraordinary moment. There is a moment that I really like in the film that really moved me. It's towards the end when we're watching with Sasha in his home, we're watching the images and everything, and we're talking about this project, the plan to fare the film, and Sasha, who is absolutely incredibly drunk, but very lucid, really explained what the film had to be. He said it in Russian, you can do what you want to do, but it has to be delicate and absolutely correct. And I said, I nodded, yes, okay, fine, we'll do our best. But when I showed him the film, and there he wasn't drunk at all, we looked at it, and it was a VHS on a very small screen. And when we got to that point in the film, he made exactly the same gesture. He put his hand on my arm and said, fine, you kept your promise. And afterwards, he told me something that I think that was something that really hit me in terms of my work. It's good. You didn't just come to film our sorrow, you brought your sorrow with you. And he's right. He hit the nail on the head, because it's returned to Kotelnitch. Yes, okay. And yes, fine. And you came back, but then there's also this extension, which is a Russian novel. We get the impression, looking back, watching Retour de Kotelnitch, that if we're talking about lifting the veil of family secrecy for your own family, you find a cinema family, a movie family, with whom you walk together for a ways. And it's true, says Mr. Carrère, because conversely to what happens most of the time, the book is kind of a novelization of the film. But it's about Kotelnitch. Another question before we take a break. Yes, we have to make sure that the roving mic will make it to you. And then we're going to take a very small break, a short break. Okay. Yeah, we'll just reconfigure things a little bit. We'll take a very short break in a couple of minutes. Yes, hello. Hello. My question is towards the end of the film, when you're on your own and you walk out into a park, you get the impression that you're filming your own disappearance, and the sentence that you say at the end. What exactly did you mean by this, what you said at the end of the film? I think that it's too elliptic, it's too abstruse. Well, in fact, I was referring to other things. It was a bit stupid to put it at that point in the film. It was impossible to understand. It was understandable based on the book that we were talking about, a Russian novel, where I told all of this love story, which took place at the same time, and which doesn't really have its place in the film. And as a result of this, but this really reflected something in reality, the kind of thing that you shouldn't do because it only concerns you. Either you explain it or you don't explain it. So I'm sorry. If you didn't understand it, it's because I did a poor job of explaining myself, or I shouldn't have kept it in the film at this point. So it was a bit pompous to film my own disappearance, so to speak. No, and I'm not very proud of this.
Vous citez plusieurs fois Lacan.
So
vous l'interprétez pas d'une certaine façon. Vous n'êtes pas posé la question.
you didn't ask yourself the question, what could this mean, this acte manqué or this regret in this respect? Well, what I mean by this is that it's not an acte manqué, but for me it was perfectly clear, but it was only perfectly clear for me. So if you don't have any kind of explanation, it's impossible for the viewer to understand. So, and during the first 10 minutes of Retour de Cotoniste, you have this long explanation and so on and so forth. And at some point in time, you say, I realize that it's a bit confused. So, well, it was, because what you evoke, this idea of my own, filming my own disappearance, and it was a bit pretentious of me, true, but the confusion at the beginning of Cotoniste, this evolves, this actually corresponds to something, but it asks the viewer, the spectator, to really, it takes a certain effort to understand it, but it does say, it describes something in the film. It tells a story about people, we don't know who they are, and they're talking, and we don't know what they're talking about. And one is speaking in a very clumsy French, and other is half French, half Russian, and everybody's a bit drunk. And yeah, okay, but I like the sentence to film your own disappearance, because what I think is beautiful in the film, this kind of corresponds to the note that you wrote on other circumstances. You see the cinema as a film director with not the certainty that you'll be able to authorize to enter this life. You were there as a script writer, and I think it's interesting to hear that you did the film editing in kind of the concierge's office. And we say, well, and you say in this note, but it's not really a fiction film, but what I find very beautiful here is I hear this film is the disappearance of the man who was writing about the film as a film critic and so on, who can actually become one of them. And you shift from the filmmaker, and you can't keep writing as a critic. You can't really mix the two up. These are two different perspectives. And what I find very beautiful to say that there's part of me that's disappearing now that the film is done. Well, you have a better answer than I did. I must say that. Yes, you could use this answer the next time around. So, now, of course, if you're a filmmaker, you can't be a critic. You can't do weekly film critiques, but you can continue criticizing. This Truffaut continued to do this. Tavernier kept on doing this as well. This kind of criticism, yes, this is quite possible. And I feel that this is entirely compatible with the exercising the trade of a film director. This lets you give thought to what you're doing and what others do in their films. And so everything that is not legitimate is these hasty judgments. And I know, because I was myself a film critic, a young film critic, and it's very tempting to really kill father and mother to get ahead. And that can be very unjust. And there's a very beautiful sentence to film my own disappearance, because you manage to do what we should always do at the end of the film, to really see oneself disappear for the pleasure of seeing oneself reappear. And I think that this is important in a film that tells. So I don't think this sentence is very explicit, but the fact of going in a direction that we hadn't imagined before, yes, that's a bit of the principle of the documentary. And in general, I feel that the more as time goes by, it's important not knowing where you're going.
maintenant, de plus en plus,
now, more and more,
vous voyez les instances que ce soit les instances qui donnent de l'argent, les chaînes,
for
les
the sponsors, the channels, the distributors, the producers, and so on. So the scripts for documentaries it's strange. If you ask for a scenario for a documentary, the principle of a documentary is that you talk about something and you don't know exactly where you're going to go.
Ah bah non, la fiction, ensuite,
there's fiction, yes, and then the whole filming process. Yes, of course, here you're constantly having surprises, but fiction means that you're following a plan. You have a scenario, a script, and it's a bit normal that you're asked for a script for a fiction film. But then sometimes you might be filming a documentary and discover another film at the end. And Truffaut said something. He used to say something.
Le voyage en diligence? C'est quoi le voyage en diligence? Quand on commence un film, on a l'impression qu'on va faire un... C'est comme les films du Far West, on a l'impression qu'on va faire un bon trajet en diligence.
It's like in the films about the Wild West.
On se demande même si on va arriver au bout de ce trajet tellement il y a d'embûches.
You realize that there are all these obstacles along the way, and the trip is really not what you imagined because all these things happen to you. No, I didn't know this expression. I know another one, because this one, to say that this is a much more radical and pessimistic idea, that a film is a process of losing oneself. Between the idea of these different scenarios and the arrival, there is a real gap. And a film that is 60% of what you were aiming at, well, that's great. 40% is not very good, and so on and so forth. But this whole question of being faithful to the film or something like that, that is up to Hitchcock, that's up to the filmmaker. As I see things, I feel much closer. As the further we move from our point of departure, the less that resembles what we thought. And the more a lot of things have happened, you've learned a lot along the way. And there's another marvelous sentence, I can't remember who wrote it, but this could very definitely, it's to say that making a film is running with a sieve full of water, and it's difficult. But fortunately, once from time to time it rains. That's a good thing. Okay, let's have a short break, and then we'll come back with the bête lumineuse. And then you get this idea of going off for a hunt. Let's have a 10-minute break now.
rester là, on va me cacher. On va te placer là. Place-toi là pour me couvrir. Penses-tu qu'elle va sortir? Probablement. Pourquoi? Ils vendent trop. Vendent trop. Vendent pas fort. Tout près, là. De quoi? 100 pieds. Ne vendent pas assez fort. Ils vendent trop fort. Ben non, ils vendent pas. Oh, je vais t'en avoir. On dit que je vais t'avoir. Tu l'as entendu? Oh, je l'ai entendu. Les gens me le trompent. Oui, sortir en trompe. Voilà. Allez, faut-tu foncer sur nous autres? C'est trop loin pour moi, ça. Bernie, là, quand il va sortir, s'il sort, tu prendras ta carabine, mais laisse-nous tirer avant. Si je le frappe, ok, Maurice le frappe, on va lancer d'autres flèches, tire pas. Si on le frappe pas, puis il reste là, laisse-nous le temps de prendre une autre flèche. Mais si là, tu vois qu'il va partir, mais prends ta carabine, puis tire. Maurice, je te jure que s'il sort, Maurice, ça va tout faire t'asseoir dans le chac. Oh, maudit, oui. Ils ne croiront jamais. Oh, moi, je l'ai fait, celui-là. Nous, les deux flèches. Transperce.
sortir Barney. T'es capable d'y parler, toi. J'ai vu quelque chose bouger. C'est quoi? Hey, c'est pas, je le vois. C'est un homme. C'est des chasseurs. C'est des chasseurs. Ils répondent à ton appel. Encore le temps, encore. Bernard, bon Dieu! C'est-tu Bernard? Ah, bon Dieu! Nous autres qui avaient peur comme deux sapins. La bête mythique, le panache, la bête lumineuse. Hey, vous êtes des beaux graves, vous autres? Hein?
Nous autres, on est pas grave, on est comme des boules. Qu'est-ce que c'est de grave? Oh, capable de marcher pareil.
Tu penses intelligent, toi?
Ah, si.
L'autre qui calait, là.
Ah, l'autre qui calait, il est capable.
Attention avec ça, toi.
On va l'avoir, Sylvain.
J'ai rien à brailler, mais je vous trouve pas mal... Fantastique.
Oh, les becs!
Ah, puis là, je l'ai là, regarde. Ça va c'est pas moi qui vais le ramener.
Oui, ça me plaît. Moi, je dois y mes lapins. Ouais, moi, je t'accuse, oui. Ah, tu sais pas sûr. Ben, toi non plus? On va acheter mes lapins ici. On va acheter, moi, toi, chez moi. Faut que tu tombes dans le trou, là. Dedans, tu sais. Un bébé folle. Ça en correct. Ça en correct? Il cuise amoureusement. Ah ouais. Bon. M'a t'aider, moi, m'a prendre une poignée pour me tenir. La femme de couvert, là. Bon. Pousse tranquillement. Femme de fourneau. Moi, je peux faire ma cuisine tranquillement. Il n'y a plus rien là maintenant. Laisse-moi t'aider à te lever, moi. Attends un peu, je vais me lever, là. Je vais mettre bien solide. Tu vas faire une chaise. Lève le bout. Lâche la chaise. On est trempe en tabarnak.
Ah, ça, c'est bien votre faute.
T'es même pas trempe, toi.
Non, moi, je suis allé à la chasse.
T'as pas même pas chassé, c'est nous autres, on a chassé, puis regarde, on est trempe.
J'ai eu peur, puis je pensais que c'était un gros mâle qui venait. J'ai même dit déjà, vous, c'est le mari, viens, dans le moins. Tu trouves ça drôle, toi? Le beau Barney qui est là, qui collette, qui appelait, ben ouais.
Je t'arrange avec, Barney, je t'arrange avec. Moi, je réponds. Puis lui, il fait sa job. Lui, il cale.
T'es un beau, toi, Barney?
Barney, viens vite. Viens vite, Barney.
Il tapait dans l'eau, il faisait sa femelle, envoie donc. Fallait ta femelle, mon Barney. Tu as l'air d'un beau cave.
C'est pas lui qui a l'air d'un beau cave, c'est toi.
C'est ça, j'ai de l'air d'un beau cave.
Ah, mais peut-être ça va dire.
T'as eu peur, Barney.
Hey, Barney,
Hein?
Il te répond, l'ornial?
Ah ouais.
Il te répond?
Ah oui.
Chris,
il sortira pas, il va sortir,
oui, il sort pas.
Ah oui. Du cas, demain matin, on va pas ensemble, Barney, hein? Non.
On va pas le faire, si j'apprends ce jour de douleur, n'importe où. Toi, t'as eu le kick. Pas nous autres. Nous autres, on a eu du fun.
Bon, puis aller avec toi. Extraordinaire, vraiment extravagant. Je pense pas d'être le chasseur dans toute l'histoire du Québec qui a connu ça.
Qu'est-ce que t'es arrivé?
Tremblé devant ces deux tatailleurs.
C'est assez d'abandonner dans l'état dans lequel ils sont.
Vous avez vraiment réussi.
Ah oui, moi je trouve que vous avez réussi pour moi parce que la bête que j'imaginais, je l'ai sentie.
Mais elle était moins lumineuse, par exemple.
Elle était lumineuse,
l'orignal, je l'ai vu, je l'ai entendu, l'orignal. Une bête merveilleuse. Mais non, à défaut de la bête merveilleuse, un résidu mythologique. Tu vois-tu le style? Regardez, là. Calvaire, quel mythe. J'ai jamais vu des orignaux de même. Jamais de ma crise de vie. Puis en plus, je disais à Barney, hey, c'est le cri du boc. Attends de voir le boc qui va sortir. Regardez les bocs. Il y avait du ravage dans le bois, mais va-tu venir? Va-tu sortir? C'est eux autres. C'est eux autres, ces sapins-là.
Moi, j'ai une chose à dire. C'était le plus beau tour qu'on m'a jamais fait. Merci beaucoup.
Toi, la première fois que tu étais à l'orignal, ils t'ont joué un tour de même?
Hein? 15 ans de tour.
Ils t'ont joué un tour de même?
15 ans de tour.
Je tremblais, moi. Non, je te le pardonne, certain. Je te donne la main, là. Mais...
Tu as dit que tu fais du bien ou tu n'as pas fait de bien? Tu n'as pas fait de bien, là. Si, mon boy, dans
on prend un petit gorgée de rince cochon aussi.
Apparemment. Alors, Emmanuel Carrère, vous avez souhaité déjà programmer dans votre carte blanche ce film assez peu vu, finalement. Il est presque aussi mythique que la bête dont
Emmanuel Carrère.
En fait, c'est une
this film is almost as mythical as the beast that it concerns. But that's a kind of false track.
C'est à la fois les scènes de chasse qu'il filme très très bien.
Hunting scenes that, of course, which he films very well. But it's not just that, it's everything that's said afterwards, the whole verbal interplay. The beast is not the one that we think it is. It's the character of Stéphane Albert. We can see with his bow, and he becomes the victim of a cruel game, the rules of which he doesn't know. When you work on your documentary narratives, what kind of hunter are you?
La première question est là. On va commencer par là. D'abord, il y a un truc, c'est que c'est très très agréable une occasion comme celle-là de choisir.
Start with the first question.
Envie de montrer. Alors, il y en a.
On such an occasion such as this, it's very nice to be able to choose the films that you would like to be shown.
Un exemple presque de poème en fait. C'est comme.
Some films are almost like a poem. This one that you're referring to, well, it's both very well known in the documentary film lovers world. Pierre Perrault, a big figure in the Quebec filmmaking scene. I believe this was the end of the 1970s. Yes, it was 1982, says the moderator. Now, at a certain point in time, the subject of the film becomes the way in which one character becomes the fall guy of the group. So there's one guy who kind of becomes the fall guy of the others, an intellectual really, says the moderator. Yes. Yes, kind of intellectual. He's part of the group, but becomes the fall guy. Now, what's exciting to see is these hunting scenes in the film. But the question that it raises in my mind is the following. What idea did Pierre Perrault have in mind when he started shooting this film? He didn't think it was going to go the way it did. So did he just say to himself, it's going to be interesting to show this group of guys who are going out hunting? Well, the film is very long. It's 2.5 hours long, so I cannot really imagine spending 2.5 hours of my life watching these people hunting, and especially as there's a lot of Quebec dialect involved in the film. This poses the question of what we are expecting and what happens at a certain point in time. It was just under 1 week, maybe 5 days. That was the shooting time. He started preparing himself only the day before. So this means that the shooting is as long as the time that it covers. I cooperated with the review Positif for a long time. I started out very young, and Positif had done a very big feature on this Pierre Perrault film, which at that time I had not seen yet. And there was a substantive interview with Pierre Perrault. Often interviews with documentary filmmakers are very interesting because they show exactly what they wanted to do at the outset. At what point in time did he realize that something absolutely unexpected was playing out in front of his eyes and which was becoming a film in its own right? What made these guys want to continue to allow themselves to be filmed without feeling embarrassed? So the film raises and asks all these questions, which are dense. There's a lot of force in the image and in the sound. This really raises the question of the documentary itself. What was the initial desire of the filmmaker at the outset? Moderator. It said that the hunter was the first to start telling a story because he was the first who could see a meaningful link. Ginsberg said this. No, they were using this metaphor to show that there's something hidden in there. Nicole Garcia, when talking about Dieu, says he cuts things up. Then the reference has also been made to a block of marble. Yes, there's a equestrian statue, and there says Mr. Carrère. There must be something hidden in the bushes. Moderator. A bit like an Indian who's serving as a guide for people in one of your films and who's peeling off the bark of a tree. Moderator. Now this may seem very obvious. It's a hunter who knows exactly what he's talking about. When I see this scene, the long scene of drunken revelry. Well, I think this is what he was expecting, says Mr. Carrère. Perrault must have attended 1 or 2 hunting scenes like this previously. I'm extrapolating, but I think this is what he was expecting. Verbal jousts and shows of their virility, people showing off their virility.
Le totalement inattendu qui peut devenir d'une certaine manière le sujet du film.
And the totally unexpected aspect, which kind of becomes the topic of the film, that really fascinates me.
il n'était pas dupe du fait d'introduire une caméra dans une situation que ça allait forcément.
But of course, he must have been aware of the fact that by introducing the camera into the scene, he was going to modify people's behavior. Yes, of course, says Mr. Carrère. How do you envisage your own, the effect of your own presence, your own participation when you decide to film something? Let's take the example of Other Lives Than Mine, which follows fairly soon afterwards a Russian novel. There is clearly a pact with the characters. There's a pact with yourself, because in Other Lives Than Mine, you are also present. You have a full-fledged place there. One which is based on closeness. And there's the family of your partner at the time. And then, taking this as a basis, you broaden out and plunge into a topic which is much vaster, Mr. Carrère. Well, this place could only really happen in this book. Well, it does happen to a certain extent in the adversary, l'adversaire. But it was assigned to me. There are books or films where you go out and look for the subject. I decide at a certain moment to go and do a report on Limonov. Then I did the report on Limonov, and I said to myself, this is very interesting. Maybe it's worth going further than this. It's a movement on my part, which I make towards that subject. I reach out towards that subject. These are things which happened to us at a certain point in time, and which I was involved in as a witness, not a neutral witness, but as a kind of accompanying person. And then there was one character, Etienne Régal, who is the colleague of my sister-in-law who had just died, and he began to talk to his family about their friendship and how they both practiced their profession of judges. And this was the first time I had met this guy, and he spoke for 2 hours about this young woman who had just died the previous day, whom I had hardly known. And I thought that what this guy was narrating was so incredibly interesting and touching that I thought of something which was both modest and pretentious at one and the same time. I thought that if I could write a book which would take 2 hours to read and which would be as long as the event that I just spent 2 hours witnessing, it would be up to me to transmit this at the end of this very bizarre session of this type, during which Etienne Régal became my friend. When I left his place, he said goodbye like you do at the end of a funeral. I was one of the last people to leave. And I was not aware that he knew that I was a writer, but he said, reflect on this. This may be something for you. I reflected on that. And then 3 or 4 days later, I called him saying, yes, I think it's for me. Let's see about it. So I found myself in a rare situation. In that this book was an order which was placed by one of these characters. So I did his portrait of his character, and the others found themselves in the same situation. It was a kind of legitimacy which I have never experienced since, which I had never experienced before or afterwards. One can always have, one often has a feeling of guilt because one thinks that one is going out and stealing images, particularly images of suffering. But here, no. And there was another part of the book, concerning the tsunami which occurred in 2005. We were in Sri Lanka in 2005 with my family. And there were some people who had been totally devastated by the death by drowning of a little 4-year-old girl. And then the grandfather, with whom we had spent days on end, said to me, well, if you're a writer, why don't you write something about that? So there I found myself legitimized in this position of a scribe, public scribe. I share Emily's view when she said that that was her favorite book of mine. It's also my favorite. It's a book which narrates terrible things, but it was written in a very comfortable psychological position. I felt that I was well placed and I was doing something good. I felt I was doing something good, that I was being useful artistically and morally as well. Moderator? Do you think that this is a book which is less edited than the Russian novel could have been? Started with l'adversaire, and then with your cycle, you invent a form of writing which is similar to something autobiographical. You accumulate notes and tracks, and at the end of the track there is maybe an animal or maybe not. So I think this is how you work on your documentary material. Yes, it's true, says Mr. Carrère. You accumulate material and a thread, and then you find an Ariane's thread, guiding thread. And in this novel, which is your favorite novel, there is this element of directness. Mr. Carrère. Yes, in the light of what you said, I tend to think that, in my experience, there are some books which work like a puzzle. You have pieces all over the place and you try to assemble them, to fit them together to see what the result is. And there are others where you pull on a thread. Sometimes the thread may break, of course, that happens. But sometimes you pull and pull the thread, and then you have a narrative line. When that happens, you feel that it's a rarer, more precious moment. Then at the same time, that there is something of this in the book you were referring to. Even the composition may appear to be rather bizarre, it came very naturally in a single movement. Moderator, to come back to Limonov, because I have several questions about this. Now, this picks up on your idea of being a scribe, a public scribe. You felt yourself in the position of a scribe when writing about Limonov. You had someone who was maybe rather contestable historian of his time. How do you position yourself in relation to a colleague? You are a character of a book when you're staging it. How do you get the novelistic desire of casting the other in the role of bad cop? Well, until Romanov styles himself fairly willingly in the role of a bad cop. That's what he wants to do.
Quelqu'un vous reprochait de le glorifier parmi les lecteurs du temps, et je me disais, moi j'ai plutôt le
someone
sentiment des fois inverse, de dire non, est-ce que des fois on n'a pas envie de le péjorer un peu pour soi-même apparaître comme le bon flic de l'affaire, le bon écrivain, celui qui nous accompagne.
Don't people want to treat you pejoratively?
Alors, il me semble que dans ce
Not
livre,
as a good writer.
je ne suis quand même pas, je suis pas au cœur du livre, je suis là comme un
I'm not at the heart of the book, I'm just there as a narrator. My position is not at the heart of the book, my position is that of a narrator, even though it's rather invasive. I think that the portrait, the hollow portrait there is rather ironical. I see myself through the eyes of Limonov, a bourgeois intellectual who's very politically correct.
Personnellement, je t'aime bien, mais si j'étais au pouvoir, je te ferais fusiller.
Says, I like you, but if I was in power, I would shoot you. I would have you shot.
Ouais, vraiment un ennemi de classe, et puis pas seulement un ennemi de classe,
mais a class enemy, and not only a class enemy.
De la couille molle occidentale, quoi, du type,
intonation
des bons sentiments, des
Western culture with good sentiments and a virtuous Democrat. So it's rather amusing to see myself being looked at in the same way as people look at Limonov. Does anyone have a question from the floor? Antoine, Albert. Someone had a question about Limonov. Absolutely wanted to ask that question. Do you want to say something about Limonov?
Obviously, I disapprove of machine gunning people in Sarajevo under the benevolent gaze of Karadzic. Well, but Limonov is a fascist, yes, okay. But notwithstanding, he's a very colorful, brave character and who had a very interesting life because he is a good character to really tell the story. Because, but the idea that I had, what I was driving at, up until now, we've been experiencing another historic event, a considerable event. When I was a contemporary, that was the end of communism. And at a certain point, I was interested, and anecdotally speaking, by the character of Limonov, his bad boy side, his adventurer side. But I realized that his trajectory was an interesting way to really tell the story of the end of communism. He never managed to realize his dream to become a leading character, but he was a bit like Forrest Gump because he was always right next to what was happening. The failed putsch in 1991, there was Sarajevo, and he was in the theater of operations. Yes, he was always there next to it. And so, now, he really wanted to be a historic figure, but he was the head of a very marginal movement. But it's also very interesting to describe this because this was a small party, a red-brown party, but at the same time, this little party, kind of punk party, this was the only culture of Russia, post-Soviet Russia. So these are really good characters that really let you describe the society behind them, that really give you the possibility of describing lots of things. Yes, true. So this was something that also has to do with documentary filmmaking. I realized not with this book, but with another book, that this teaching dimension. This is not very prestigious literary or artistically speaking, this whole idea of pedagogy. And I realized this because this judge that I mentioned, at a certain point in time, he started to explain to me what he and his sister were doing in their domain, which was really not justice, the court of assize and so on, but it was kind of neighborhood justice system. And they were specialists in the law relating to over-indebtedness. Now, if you're interested in someone who's doing this, this is something, it's to show a character, he's a judge, okay, he's a lawyer, okay, fine. But here, I think that you really had to understand what he was doing, what his function is. And that is very important. That has an impact on people's lives. And so I spent a lot of time having him explain what he did and then explaining to him on my own. This was one, it's not difficult in terms of inspiration, but in terms of, it's a huge undertaking because you really have to understand and then to make sure that you're explaining it properly to others. And this is something that really created kind of an idea of pride, the pride of a good craftsman. So there's 40 pages on over-indebtedness, and I'm quite proud of this. And then I experienced the same pleasure when I did a kind of a history on the end of communism, and then kind of a history book on the first Christians. And this is very technical. First, you have to acquire the knowledge, you have to kind of store up this knowledge, you have to read books about it. What I like is to be on a couch reading in a book, because I get the impression that I'm working as I'm doing this. So there are whole libraries on the beginnings of Christianity and so on. And this book, Le Royaume, there's no expert who disagreed with it, and so it's quite reliable. But what did I want to say? What was I looking for? Pédagogie. So often people they pretend that we know as much as they do. Or if you don't have an academic background. But I really make an effort. Now, in the book, and this is, I talk about a number of my readers who might know who Anna this Almatova, this very famous Russian poetess. So I more or less explain this, who Almatova was, and say that after a certain number of pages, having mentioned her several times, the reader who didn't know anything realizes who Anna Almatova is. And this is a certain amount of satisfaction for me. So this is, and I find that this is, you have to really treat the reader properly, and this is part of it, and this has its role. And there's another thing that comes up. You looked at this over-indebtedness, you studied this, you read books about it so you could understand this, and but you were seeing this from the outside, of course. But when you tell something, back at the time, the COVID era, 2020 and so on, but nobody, but now, because it's obvious for everybody, well, yeah. So how can you, as a writer, how can you kind of come up with a position on this? Well, this is really a very specific situation, but I'm not really sure. From this point of view, for anyone who's interested in the arts or in the art of the narrative or the representative arts, well, it's very, very interesting what's going to happen. So indeed, we are all experiencing a gigantic event. We are sharing this. What will this lead to? Well, I really don't know. And often in movies, we read books to learn about others, and we get news of Italy or France and so on. But what are we going to do with COVID? Are we going to get news of people who are looking for the same things as we are? Well, people have always all had their own experience, confronted with the same obstacles, the same problems, and this takes different forms depending on the place and so on. And this is all the more interesting because there is a basis, common shared experiences. People all experience this differently. And yes, the 52nd edition, we got a lot of films that talked about COVID, the lockdown, but the very singular perspectives on the shared event were very rare. On the other hand, there was almost kind of a factory of films getting turned out when we were all locked down. And these were kind of like, these popped up like plastic flowers. They were very relevant and impactful. And with regard to the situation, the world situation, there weren't that many really outstanding films. But for example, publishing houses, they saw all of these stories about COVID coming and people lockdown journals and so on, diaries. And at some point, yes, something will come forth, something out of the ordinary, but I really don't have a clue. I would like to ask you another question because there are a few more questions that have come in via internet that have to do with your last work, recently published. A question with regard to yoga, your latest work, a very serious question. Do you think that there is a meaning to pain, at least your pain? Well, it does help to think that it does have some meaning because we don't like to think that we have suffered or we are suffering in vain. So, yes. Now, does this improve us? Does this, because what doesn't kill me makes me stronger, all this kind of thinking? Well, I'm not really sure. Honestly, I'm not sure. Because as far as I'm concerned, I was able to exploit this. Yes, I leveraged it. Really leveraged it, or was one of the driving forces for you? Well, I mean, leveraging it, this isn't pejorative. I'm not trying to say that I made money off it. No. And for example, a filmmaker said, you put yourself in situations that are a bit masochistic. You kind of look for this pain to put yourself in difficulties, and then you can get something for a novel out of it. So that you can experience this firsthand, and then you can tell the story afterwards. Well, I mean, you're really pushing me pretty far here. Well, I mean, there's nothing wrong with masochism. It turns out great writers, for example. Well, in fact,
mais quand je dis ces jours-ci,
recently, these days, I mean, for example, today,
en ce moment, je suis en train de
at the present, I'm reading in very special conditions because I'm reading the manuscript of my best friend. We read each other's works, and I know that reading is a very important act for me. So I'm reading his manuscript. So I'm reading it because I have to discuss it with him next week. So when I'm at the hotel, then I read some. But it's I'm a bit intimidated by this writer because I really couldn't write this kind of thing. It's quite difficult to read. So I'm reading my friend Hervé's book to learn a little bit about this facet. And when it comes down to it, I could say what I understand. It's this idea that joy is an exact understanding, a broader understanding of reality, and that the pain, suffering are unreal, less real, or poor information. If we suffer, it's because we're not properly updated. We don't have the right information. So I think that this is a line of thinking. I could really learn from this, yes, granted, but clearly there are a lot of objections that you could raise to this doctrine, which seems to be dictated by common sense and experience. But we could be faced with suffering that is much worse than what I have experienced, I myself have experienced. I think that here, Spinoza's doctrine really isn't much help to us. So I was trying to kind of wiggle out of this. You didn't. When they said the lake was 7 degrees, I honestly, 7 minutes of pleasure and pain at the same time. Do you do it? But I'm really not that courageous. But I mean, I didn't dare do it. No, I chickened out. And I said to myself, 7 minutes? You really feel those 7 minutes go by? I suppose, yeah, there's this pain and pleasure. And you said, do you get the impression that from what you imagined about your future voyage when you were a child, do you feel that you're in a documentary film, that your life took an unexpected turning? No, let me come back to Luminov. I don't think that he would remain faithful to his dream, even though his dream didn't turn out the way he wanted. He never gave up on his dream. He never compromised. And at the same time, he really didn't manage to become a huge hero or something, head of a state or something like this. So here, once again, this is a dream of a little boy, but he never gave up on this dream. As Lacan said, he didn't give up on his desire. Now, as far as I'm concerned, there's one thing very early in life, what I wanted to do was write books, and I was fortunate enough to write books and to make films. If that's the meaning of my life, the center of my life, yes, that's my profession, and I've gained a certain amount of recognition in this occupation. Okay, fine. But now, what I would like to say is, I don't know how much time I have left in life.
Je fais une parenthèse pour
Let me just open a parenthesis here. A brief digression, because we're talking about the perspective. I'm speaking as a writer and as a filmmaker. There is an article by George Orwell, which is very good, like everything else he wrote, which is very good. It's why I write. And in any case, he draws up a list of the reasons, the motivating factors that make him write. And on this list, the first thing, according to Orwell, is vanity, the desire to be known, to be admired, to turn the tables on the stronger, the ones who beat up on you during break at school. Okay. Okay, fine. The second motivating factor is love for work that's well done, to do the best possible job, to exercise one's occupation as well as you can. Now, the third one is what he calls the political ambition, the desire to change the world, to denounce injustices, to act on reality. The fourth reason to write is what he calls the historical vision. Here it's a bit harder to understand. Try to have the broadest possible perspective. In English, there's an expression which I really like, to think outside of the box. Try to get out of yourself, out of your intellectual conditioning, your background, and to come up with a broader vision of things. A more accurate vision of things. These are the four motivating factors. I think there's another one, because with Orwell, the political vision was paramount. I think that narcissism was present, but perhaps not as much with someone else, like, for instance, me. But in any case, what I think that he forgets is this autobiographical impulse, which I think is an honorable thing, which is not the same thing as really to give something based on oneself. Because if he didn't say this, it was because it was a very foreign idea to him that didn't cross his mind. Now, in my case, I can see, okay, narcissism, yeah, there's a big share of that. The share of the taste for work well done is very important. This is perhaps what really saves me, morally speaking. Yes, I really like my trade, to exercise my trade, to really polish a sentence, a turn of phrase, to do it as best possible. And I really spare no effort. The political vision is rather weak for me, and this is what I'm coming back to, because when it comes down to it, how would I like to kind of see the upgraded version of myself, the Mark II version? This would be to think more outside the box. But this, here again, this isn't something that you can tell yourself, well, I'm going to do this more. It's try to decondition oneself to see things differently, so that you're not just this little man stuck in his or her box. So I think here, this is really, as a filmmaker and writer, I would really like to progress in this respect. I think that this is possible, and regardless of the amount of time it takes, this is really a path to be traveled. Time. The time allotted to us is coming to its end, because here you speak of this fifth condition that enables you to write, to think outside the box, Okay, what kind of avenues, possible avenues, where are you aiming right now? Well, I have one idea, and I can say this, it's not a secret, but it's really quite substantial. And as from September in Paris, they're going to start with the trial of the 13 November 2015 Bataclan and terrorist attacks, the terrorist attacks. Obviously, no one is expecting that Salah Abdeslam will be acquitted of all charges against him, but this will be a gigantic trial. This will last for months, 8 or 9 months, or most of the year, in fact. There are 1,800 civil parties, 300 lawyers, a very secure environment. Now, this means that in itself, that is going to be an event which I think it will be worth recounting this, narrating this on a daily basis. And we have to note things about time. I can't really see myself writing a novel about jihadism, but I decided to follow this trial. And this means, well, a year, that's pretty heavy. It's a bit like a marathon. That means that mentally it's very grueling. How do you prepare for this physically? I try to say that I'm on holiday in the meantime. I'm going to say that the year is going to be tough, and so I read things, and so the preparation is and I try to really take some time off. Now, before you used to go on holiday, so this idea of let's work, I really got the impression that we've heard you on a lot of different subjects. We had a very far-ranging discussion. We're very grateful to you for that. I found it very interesting and a free-ranging discussion. I hope that we said something of interest that might be interesting for the audience. So we wish you every success with your new, because thank you very much, Emmanuel Carrère. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you very much. I would just like to say that the films are presented here on Nyon. We didn't say anything about the fact that this homage to Emmanuel Carrère is also organized with the Swiss Cinematheque in Lausanne and the Swiss Filmmathèque, and they're presenting a selection of films by Emmanuel Carrère, and it's open, it's reopening, because if you knew how happy we are at the idea that we can actually go back to the Cinematheque and actually go back to the movie theaters. Thank you very much. And obviously online. Yes. There are 3 viewing rooms. Thank you very much, says Mr. Carrère. Thank you.